Welcome to Stories of Art. I'm James Fox.
And I'm Alastair Sook.
I intend to continue being generous, cried the Pope heartily. I am going to favour you above all the painting masters of Italy. Painting masters? Yes, I have decided that you are the best artist to complete the work begun by your countrymen. I am commissioning you to complete my Uncle Sixtus's chapel by painting the ceiling. There was a light patter of applause. Michelangelo was stunned. Nausea gripped him. He cried passionately, I'm a sculptor, not a painter. Julius shook his head in despair. I had less trouble conquering Perugia and Bologna than I have in subduing you. Now that, Alastair,
It's not Vasari, is it?
No, that is an excerpt from Irving Stone's 1961 novel, The Agony and the Ecstasy, which told the story of Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel, which a few years later was turned into a film in which Charlton Heston, no less, played Michelangelo.
Right.
And in this episode, we are going to tell the thrilling tale of the Sistine Chapel ceiling and much else besides. Now, Alastair, last time we talked about David, world-famous piece, you would think it would be impossible to outdo it.
Yes.
But with the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo probably does.
I think he definitely does. I am slightly still mindful of your accusation at the beginning of the series when you said I was trying to wriggle out of doing Michelangelo. And you are right, I did feel a bit daunted, partly because I'm still sort of toying with it. I think it felt a bit like we were attempting to scale Mount Everest. Before in the podcast, we got into any other peaks in art history. And yet here we are.
Here we are.
We have our ice picks. We have our masks. The oxygen is thinning. And we're ascending towards the Sistine ceiling, which is this canonical high point, isn't it, of Western art. And I think the thing that's fascinating, I didn't know you were going to read out that extract from that would we call it a pot boiler?
I think so.
But it gets to the heart of this tension within Michelangelo, which is that we think of him as often as a sculptor. But of course, it's in painting, which he himself tried to resist half the time, that he achieves some of his greatest things. And I think the Sistine Chapel is the perfect example of that, right?
It's one of the greatest achievements in human history, I think. So there's a lot to get through. First of all, a little recap, just to remind listeners where we got to. Michelangelo was born in 1475, trained as an artist in his native Florence, but really announced himself as an emerging talent with his great sculpture of the Pietà in Rome in 1499.
So graceful, we touched on that. Yeah, beautiful work of art.
A wonderful piece that he makes as a young man. He then returns to Florence, creates the statue of David, one of the most famous artworks in Western history, we've already said. And Michelangelo was then offered the chance to construct Pope Julius II's tomb.
Yes.
But the Pope famously, as we discussed in the previous episode, withdrew that commission, much to Michelangelo's rage.
I think you used the word ghosted him.
He ghosted him. Yeah, he ghosted him. And in 1508, when Michelangelo was 33 years old, he asked him instead to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So this then is the next instalment of our mighty series on the life and work of Michelangelo. Right, Alastair, I think we should begin really by saying something about the Sistine Chapel itself.
What it is.
What it is.
Yes.
So this is a building that's built in the 1470s within the Vatican by, as that passage at the start of the episode made clear, by Julius II's uncle,
also Pope
Sixtus IV. That's why it's called the Sistine Chapel, because it's named after Sixtus. So it's effectively a very important building because it's the private chapel for the Pope himself within the Vatican. But it's also, as people who might have read and indeed watched the recent film Conclave will know, it is the space in which the College of Cardinals is gathered to select the next Pope. So it's got great political significance, great spiritual significance. So Sixtus builds this structure in the 1470s and soon after invites the greatest painters from Florence to decorate the walls. So he has Perugino, who's Raphael's master. He has Sandro Botticelli. He has Domenico Ghirlandaio, Michelangelo's own master.
Yes.
Beautiful frescoes all around the wall.
And these are depicting scenes from the life of Moses.
Yes.
And also Christ.
Yes. The ceiling is not quite so elaborate.
No.
So the ceiling is really just a blue sky with some stars.
Possibly gold.
Possibly some golden stars in there. I'm
Yes.
sure it's very pleasant. Actually, it's something that happened a lot in that period. So the Arena Chapel, for instance, painted by Giotto, is a blue sky with golden stars. But there were some problems because in the subsequent decades after the construction of the building, there's subsidence. The building starts to move under the soil and the ceiling begins to crack. And in the very early 1500s, they'd done some remedial works. They'd installed some iron bars into the ceilings and patched it up. So if you had gone into the Sistine Chapel in the early 1500s, the ceiling would have been an absolute mess.
As in you could visibly see a crack.
There was like a stitch, a white plaster stitch running all the way down the ceiling. You'd still see some of the blue sky, but essentially it was a mess. So there had been a plan for a while that they had to try to do something about this. And of course, Michelangelo, 1508, is down in Rome.
Yeah.
Julius doesn't want to lose him because he's the greatest artist in Italy. The tomb that Michelangelo was so desperate to do is not happening. And he thinks, you know what, I'll get him to paint the ceiling. And of course, famously, Michelangelo does not want to do it.
He's not keen. He even suggests that, well, he's quite paranoid about it, isn't he? Because as you've established with that Irving Stone passage at the beginning of this part, he considered himself primarily a sculptor.
Yeah.
He could also be quite paranoid and competitive. And he thought there was a bit of a plot going on with other factions, didn't he? Within the Vatican, with other artists and architects, some of whom were kinsmen. Two in particular, Bramante, the great architect, and Raphael, the kind of young Turk painter who was coming along and was clearly preferred as a painter by Pope Julius II, and in fact would be by his successor, Leo X. And he's thinking that the plot is, tell you what, Julius, why don't you get Michelangelo in, get him to paint the ceiling, because they're thinking he won't be able to do this.
Yeah.
It's a vast piece of work. This is a guy who's known as a sculptor. His last experience painting something on this scale would have been as an apprentice in the workshop of Ghirlandaio when they were working on a chapel in a church in Florence for a big, which sort of survives as his fresco cycle. But that would have been in around about 1490, early 1490s. Yeah. So that's going back a bit. He doesn't have the first-hand experience. So Michelangelo's thinking, this is a trap. Yeah. And he actually, I think he even says to the Pope, according to Vasari and other sources, I think you should get Raphael to do it.
Yeah.
It can't be me.
He's properly cornered because if he refuses, he gets in serious trouble. He's already been in trouble with the Pope. He's lucky to still have his life. If he says no again, he's in trouble. And if he takes it on, he's really got, as you say, very little experience painting at this scale. He's done some lovely paintings. There are two in the National Gallery, both of which are unfinished.
Yes.
There's another lovely picture he does in the Uffizi earlier on in his life. But these are relatively small easel pictures, pictures on panel. He has never painted at this scale before, 500 metre squared ceiling. So
do you think he's also feeling a bit knocked because he was so into the vision of the tomb?
Oh, I think so.
And it was so ambitious. It's going to be the lifetime's work. And obviously he loves being in the quarries. He loves selecting the marble. He's fastidious about marble. He loves carving. And then suddenly that's taken away.
Yeah.
And this other thing that he's invited to do, which he doesn't really like. And we know that he himself, I mean, you know, that extract at the start alludes to the fact there was always this butting of heads between these two great egotists in Michelangelo and Julius II, which I really wanted to bring this up in a previous part, and this is the moment to do it because I forgot. But I always find it weird with Julius because he's the warrior pope. There is this wonderful portrait by Raphael, which is in the National Gallery, in which you see him with a beard and his robes on a throne. And the surprise of it to me is that he looks always, in this picture, he looks quite feeble. He looks to me like this kind of, he's in red with the big beard, like a sort of miserable Father Christmas who's there in his throne.
Yes.
And he doesn't seem like this guy who has this great ego who's impressing himself on the age. And yet we know that's what's going on. And in a funny way, the Sistine Chapel, we're discussing it through the artist prism and thinking about it, it's Michelangelo's great achievement. But in a sense, it is the great monument to Julius himself, even though the tomb that eventually is created in a very different, reduced form isn't quite the original intention.
Yeah, Michelangelo was very attached to the tomb and was hoping, that if he kept refusing other things, he would eventually get the tomb. But he is basically screwed. He has no options. He has to do the ceiling. And so in May 1508, he relents to Julius II's demands and he signs the contract. It's actually a very good contract, gets paid a lot of money to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling.
And whilst we're on Julius, I mean, one of the great questions with the Sistine ceiling the whole time is, which I know we'll get into, but is the programme and what he paints and who comes up with it. And we do know a bit about Julius's original idea, right, for the ceiling. I don't know whether that was where you were particularly going at that moment or not, but he has an idea that somehow the decoration of the ceiling should involve painting the apostles. And Michelangelo has other ideas about it, doesn't he?
Yes. Well, we will come to that. We will come to the programme because it's a fascinating programme. I think the first thing we need to address straight off is, so he signs the deal in May 1508. There is a myth about the Sistine ceiling, in many ways promoted by the Charlton Heston film, that Michelangelo worked alone.
Yes.
That he was there in this building for 4 years, this titanic achievement.
Well, partly because it's put about by Vasari.
And by Michelangelo, indeed. But the truth is that it was actually, at least initially, a quite sizable team of people. Yes. So there was Michelangelo, here was old childhood friend Francesco Granacci, who was the foreman, one of the only people Michelangelo actually trusted at this point. There were 4 painting assistants. There were rope makers, there were scaffold builders, there were plasterers. So if you had gone into the Sistine Chapel in 1508, shortly after the project started, it would have been like a construction site today. There'd have been a group of men, maybe as many as a dozen men actually in the building, laughing, joking, making things, building things, fixing the ceiling. And
just as an aside on that, I mean, Michelangelo comes, of course, from Florence. This isn't a moment, as you've already established in this series, when Italy is unified. There are these different states. Yeah. And I find it quite interesting that some of the assistants that he involves, he gets them back. They're from Florence. They're people he's known and worked with, old friends, probably in the workshop, perhaps even people who'd worked on that fresco cycle that I mentioned before, around about 1490. And there's this sense of kind of rival factions.
Yeah.
And also it's a reminder, I think, of the fact that although Michelangelo is seen as being such a difficult figure, he could also really inspire quite fierce loyalty. He could really inspire fierce loyalty. And that's, as you're saying, if you'd gone in the early days into the Sistine Chapel, you would have had that sense of collegiality, of a bunch of people all working together who were kind of mates.
Yes, exactly. And so and they're all relatively young. They're all, in their 20s and 30s and so on and so forth. So in the first few months, Michelangelo, while those men are building the scaffolding and looking at the ceiling and making good and getting the plaster work ready, Michelangelo is drawing. And in fact, I think he spends about 4 months drawing, plotting out the composition. He makes hundreds, perhaps even 1,000 drawings.
Very few survive.
Very few survive. Those that do are extraordinary. So he spends 4 months making those drawings, and it's eventually in October 1508, so 4 or 5 months after signing the contract, that Michelangelo is ready to start painting his fresco. We should tell, I think, the listeners what a fresco actually is, because it's not as straightforward as it might seem, even though it probably doesn't seem straightforward anyway.
I think it's the sort of technicality of it and the process involved is interesting. And the fact that there was a big team working on it, when you know what fresco is, that becomes apparent that had to be the case. So fresco, it's a wall painting technique. It involves using pigments which have been dissolved in water, which are applied to this prepared surface on the wall, which is a fresh and wet lime plaster. And I think the Italian term for this layering is the intonaco. The intonaco. So, it's very complex. You'd have a kind of rougher layer which is put down first, and then separately you have the artist working on the design that would be painted eventually on the wall. And those designs are known as cartoons, and they are full-scale, one-on-one preparatory drawings.
Yeah.
And then the point is that when the pigment is eventually painted onto the plaster, the stuff bonds, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's a chemical reaction, and the pigment, when that dries, it becomes integral to the surface of the wall itself.
Yes.
And it has this quite vitreous, slightly glossy, but resilient layer.
Yeah.
So you don't need any varnish afterwards. But what it does mean is that there's a time pressure to paint.
Yes.
And so fresco painters would know that you'd basically you had a few hours. The plaster gets put on the wall. Whilst it's still wet, you can apply the pigment. And I don't know whether we've got time to get into, but you have the design of the cartoon that has to be transferred onto the wall. That's fascinating. That's why a lot of these preparatory drawings don't survive, because
sometimes you would cut through them.
You cut them
to
up.
score, to incise the outline of the figures onto the wall.
Well, there are two techniques. I mean, I find this really interesting. I know I don't want to get bogged down in it, but you have the
We're going to
cartoon.
talk about pouncing now.
I'm going to talk about pouncing. Pouncing is such a good word. It deserves to be an Eddie podcast, possibly every podcast we do. But so you have your drawing, it gets applied to the surface, and either, as you say, you use a stylus, so you sort of rub around the outline, and that's transferring the image in terms of a sort of faint incision into the plaster. Or you do your pouncing, where you prick the outlines of the drawing with tiny little holes, and then you pass probably charcoal dust through those holes, take away the drawing, the cartoon, and you're left with that. You're left with that outline, which you can work. But there is this time pressure.
That is, I think, the crucial thing to understand with a fresco. You are working against the clock. Unlike in an oil painting, where you can work on an oil painting and rework it for years, fresco, you have a few hours. If it's a very hot day, it could be 2 hours. If it's a cool day, you might be able to get as much as a day's worth of work. But you have to complete your part of the picture. So you have something called a giornata. So you make the plaster for the day's worth of work.
I mean, that's literally what it means, right?
It means the day's work, yeah. And you need to complete that part of the picture before the plaster dries. And if you don't, then, that whole part of plaster needs to be removed and you need to start again. And if you make a mistake, well, it's game over. You have to remove everything and start all over again. It's a very difficult technical exercise. And there are many people in the history of art who are great painters on oil and tempera who would not have known how to do a fresco. It's a specialist skill.
I mean, you can do some touch-ups and you can apply some pigment. It's called a secco, working when it's on the dry, but that would come later. And that wasn't really what you were meant to be doing. There's a technicality which I find quite amazing, like an added layer of complexity, that you can apply highlights when you're painting fresco. But if your colours you're using, if their base is green or black, when they dry, they become lighter.
Yes.
And if you have colours which have got iron oxides in them, when they dry, they become darker. So if you're a fresco painter, you need to be mindful of stuff like that when you're actually creating the painting. So, there's a huge amount of technical stuff you need to be on top of, and also technical stuff which assistants can help with. The preparation of cartoons, obviously the building of a scaffold, you've alluded to that already, the applying of these different forms of plaster.
Frankly, it's a nightmare, isn't it?
Yeah,
no wonder he didn't want to do it.
Exactly. Get Raphael to do it.
Exactly. So anyway, then of course we've mentioned this very briefly, Alastair, there's the scheme of the ceiling. So the scheme, to put it very, very simply, the ceiling is dominated by the book of Genesis, the first book in the Old Testament. So you get the creation of the world, the creation of Adam and Eve, you get the expulsion from the garden, you get Noah and the flood. And this central set of panels is surrounded by an architectural framework with prophets and sibyls and various other figures. It's a very complicated scheme, and there's a lot of debate about where it comes from. I don't know where you stand on that.
So, I mean, as I've said already, there is this idea that, to begin with, Julius himself has an idea for what the scheme should be. And he's suggesting that probably around the edges at the top, I think, Michelangelo should be painting the apostles, and there could be conventional decorative ornament in the barrel vault, the ceiling of the chapel itself. But there are a couple of sources where Michelangelo talks about this, that Michelangelo, thought that this scheme would be, quote, a poor thing. And that he goes back to the Pope and basically tells him this, and this is the idea that Michelangelo puts about. The Pope eventually goes, well, you know what? Yeah, if you think you can do something more magnificent, you must do it. I can't help wondering whether there's, again, like myth-making at play here. There must be, right? Because it's sort of Michelangelo's taking sole credit. We've already established that it's highly unlikely, this idea that he's put about, that he can paint it all by himself, even Vasari says, down to grinding and preparing the pigments. The scheme in such an important place within the Vatican,
Exactly.
the ceremonial heart of the papal state, the idea that this artist can come in.
The most powerful man in Christendom would essentially delegate the scheme itself, the iconography in this building, to effectively an artisan. Of course, Michelangelo is challenging those conventions, but is still a manual worker.
Yes.
Seems for the birds to me.
Totally. So we have to assume that there must have been some sort of theologian, some council, some advisor from the Vatican who's working with Michelangelo to arrange what the scheme would be. And I mean, you've just summarized it and in a very effective fashion. But it's worth just reminding listeners that just the sort of, even the things you've described, there are complexities to how he's going to paint around the ceiling, because you have all of these. I went down a slight rabbit hole before this, which I won't drag you down into. But
it's not pouncing again, is it?
It's not pouncing,
No.
but it is some other kind of amazing terminology, because there are all of these weird architectural things that he's having to contend with. Lunettes, spandrels, pendentives, groins. These are basically complex architectural sort of zones and spaces in and around the ceiling, which he is having to decorate. And it's giving him a headache, one would assume, creatively.
And literally.
And literally, because, it's not straightforward.
No, it's not straightforward. So anyway, he's done all these drawings, months and months of drawings. Eventually, in October 1508, they can actually start painting this fresco. And they begin by painting...
You don't want to talk more about the spandrels? No.
Well, maybe the groins.
Yeah, okay.
No, so he starts in October 1508, and they begin painting the part of the ceiling near the entrance, which is the east part of the building. And they probably start painting that panel first because it's the least visible.
And this is it's worth saying that, so this is, you're describing one of the 9 central scenes from the book of Genesis that run along the length of the ceiling.
Yeah, right through the middle.
The altar is at the west end of the chapel. The entrance is at the east end.
Yes.
And so he's starting weirdly, narratively in reverse.
Yes. And I think he's starting at the east end because it's not so easy to see. You don't see it so easy. If you go into the Sistine Chapel today, you don't see it quite so easily because he's thinking, well, I haven't got any experience doing this. If it's not that great, it will be okay. And indeed, it turns out to be not that great.
Yeah.
So the first scene Michelangelo paints is the flood, the story of Noah. And it's an absolute catastrophe. So they spend about a month painting it. They're not happy with the composition at all. And then, of course, very appropriately, that autumn and winter 1508, there are terrible rains. It's a very, very wet autumn. And the plasterwork starts to get damp, starts to get mouldy.
Yes.
And so they have to take everything off and start all over again.
I mean, he is quite dispirited.
He's furious about this. He, as we say, he did not want to do this. He did not want to take on this project. He doesn't have sufficient experience. And indeed, that first panel takes months and months and months. And by the time you get to early 1509, Julius is coming in and he's thinking, well, I signed this deal 7-8 months ago, and there is nothing on the walls. There is nothing on the ceiling at all. So he begins to get very frustrated about this. There are all these wonderful stories, probably apocryphal, told by Vasari and Condivi, about these altercations between Julius and Michelangelo, aren't there?
It's the art history soap opera.
Yeah.
It's the kind of butting of heads.
Yes.
Is this the moment where the Pope threatens Michelangelo to chuck him off the scaffold?
Yeah, there are various stories. I mean, there's one story in which the Pope comes up onto the scaffold and says, when are you going to finish? And Michelangelo says, when I can. And the Pope gets furious and starts beating him with his staff. He threatens to throw him off the scaffold. There is another incident in which the Pope is so desperate to see the progress. Michelangelo has bolted the doors that the Pope bribes one of Michelangelo's assistants to let him in the nighttime. Michelangelo catches wind of this scheme, so hides on the scaffold. And when the Pope walks in, he starts throwing bits of wood at him. So there are real tensions there. But Michelangelo carries on working through 1509, and he gradually gets better as he goes on. He gets more efficient as he goes on. So the first sequence, the first scene of the flood takes several months, but he gets quicker, and he's starting moving west across the ceiling towards the altar wall.
I mean, there is, given that we're in 1509, at the very start of the year, he does write to his dad. And it's quite an amazing, I don't know if I'm sure you've come across this, maybe you've got it in front of you, but it's an amazing passage because it's this moment where, context-wise, it's Sistine Chapel ceiling, it's Michelangelo. We imagine he's kind of God on earth, superhuman. But actually, as you've established, he's experiencing doubt, difficulties. Yes. It's a challenge. And he has essentially this crisis of confidence. He writes to his dad and he says, I'm still in a great quandary because it's now a year since I had even one grosso, a coin, from this pope, and I do not ask for anything because my work does not seem to go ahead in a way to merit it. This is due to the difficulty of the work, and also because it's not my profession. In consequence, I waste my time fruitlessly. May God help me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, he's not in a good place.
Oh, he's hating it. There's actually a poem as well. Can I read this poem that he writes? This is a fantastic poem. So Michelangelo wrote hundreds of poems in his life, and they're a mixed bag. Some aren't so great, but some are absolutely stunning. And I'm going to read another one later on in the series because I think it's extraordinary. But this is what he writes about the physical challenges of being up on that ceiling. He writes, a goiter, it seems, I got from this backward craning. My belly tugged under my chin's all out of whack. Beard points like a finger at heaven. Near the back of my neck, skull scrapes where a hunchback's lump would be. I'm pigeon-breasted, a harpy, face dribbled, see, like a Byzantine floor mosaic. From all this straining my guts and my ham bones tangle, I'm bent like a bow. What's on my mind when expressed comes out weird, jumbled. Don't berate, no gun with its barrel screwy can shoot straight. I don't belong. Who's a painter? Me? No way, they've got me wrong. Isn't that incredible?
It is amazing. You obviously couldn't really sue your employer for your working conditions in those times, so you could write a sort of comical poem.
Yes.
Is this the one where when he's sending it to a friend, there's the sketch next to it?
There's a little drawing of him
he's
painting
dangling.
upwards. Yes,
yeah.
Because in the film, in the Charlton Heston film, he's lying flat on his back on the platform, painting quite nicely. That is not how Michelangelo did it. He was standing upright, and he got such neck strain, in fact, that even for years afterwards, actually, when he received letters, he would have to read the letters above his head because it was the only way he could read. So physically, as well as artistically, as well as intellectually, as well as personally and psychologically, this is a very, very grueling exercise.
I find that sketch quite fascinating because it's a tiny detail, but he does look like a hanged man.
Yeah.
There's a sense of kind of, again, the whole project killing him, essentially, physically. But you also see what could be, there's this kind of bizarre sketch of what he's painting above, and it's quite explosive. Almost like a sort of, I mean, this really is an aside, but like a sort of a mini explosion of inspiration above his head. And the thing that, you're, I guess, building to, but with the scenes from Genesis in particular that run along the ceiling, they really can sort of be divided into two halves in terms of quality. And we're still in that first half where he's not quite getting everything right. It doesn't necessarily have the unity and coherence and isn't so brilliantly visible and legible from the floor.
I think that's a really important point. I think that when we look at the Sistine Chapel, we just think it's a work of unparalleled, completely universal genius.
Yeah.
And it is. Collectively, it is that. But actually, when you look at it very closely, what you see is as you look from the east where he started to the west where he finished, he gets better and better and better. And what he realises, Alastair, is that less is more.
Yes.
You have fewer figures, you have larger figures.
They become more monumental, more powerful.
Yeah, and you can actually see that happening. You can see those works getting better. He's also getting much quicker at it. So the Flood, which is the first panel he starts, that takes months to complete. By the time he gets to the end, which is effectively the beginning in scriptural time, so it's God dividing light from darkness, he does the whole panel without any drawings in one day.
I mean, those are the really incredible parts of the ceiling. And you have God is sort of, he's whooshing about in the cosmos. We've gone into this different realm of kind of real primal origins of the universe and creativity itself. I mean, I think the very last one, you have this sense almost of this cosmic vortex where you're sort of, because in the initial scenes, in a way, it's quite conventional picture making where the scene is sort of parallel to the surface of the picture. So it's like you're looking through a window onto a scene. But that changes and gets switched up, doesn't it, towards the end with the way he's depicting God going about his business, separating what is it?
Light from
Separating
darkness.
Light from dark, creating the sun and the moon.
Yeah.
This kind of great... You just wonder whether as well there's a sort of sense of identity on some deep, primal, unconscious, artistic level of Michelangelo himself with the great supreme creator whom he's depicting.
Oh, I'm sure.
There must be, given who he is.
Yes, he had a sizable ego, Michelangelo. But let's discuss, I mean, there are so many images to discuss on the ceiling, but let us focus on the creation of Adam. And the reason I think we select this is not necessarily that it's the best, although it is fantastic, but that it's so recognizable to the world. I think all of our listeners will be able to summon this image of God creating Adam. You've got these two male figures, their hands reaching out to each other, their fingers almost touching. This is the moment when God creates Adam, gives him life.
Yes.
For me, I do think this is a work of just staggering genius. And I know it's very well known. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but
You've
sometimes...
really stuck your neck out there, James.
Well, sometimes things are cliche. Cliches are cliches because they've got something going for them.
Yes.
And this is seriously good. One of the things, before we examine it in a bit more detail, one of the fascinating things about fresco is you can actually, by looking at the parts of the plaster, the giornate, as we've been talking about, you can actually work out how many days it has actually taken to be made. And we know quite clearly that the creation of Adam, this was 16 days of work.
Really?
16 days. So he took 4 days on Adam.
Yeah.
So 1 day on Adam's head in the sky, 1 day on the torso and the arms, 2 days on his legs. He spent 4 days on God. So it's a 16-day job.
Right.
I think it's a pretty good outcome for 16 days worth of work.
Given this is the pinnacle of the whole Western painting tradition.
Well, I think so. And I think, what is genius? Genius is when you find a solution to something that no one would have imagined before.
Yeah.
And I think that is what he does here. I mean, to understand how truly incredible this image is, you have to look at the biblical text that he's basing it on. So there's a passage in the Bible, Genesis 2:7, and this is the passage. It says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." That is the source. Now,
nostrils are a little awkward, aren't they? If you were going to depict the nostril, the breathing moment.
Exactly. I mean, how do you depict that in a nice way without it looking like sort of CPR or something like that?
Yes.
And so Michelangelo has to find a completely different way of representing this moment of life passing from one to the other, the moment when, if you like, the batteries get put into the machine.
What I love about that is that right in the middle where you have the two fingers almost touching but not touching.
Yeah.
And so having that little void, you, the viewer, almost imagine the spark passing from one fingertip to the other.
They're 1.9 centimetres apart.
Right.
But that's absolutely, we mentioned in a previous episode about David, Michelangelo often chooses the moment before.
Yes.
And it's crucial to the success of his work because the moment before is pregnant with tension and pregnant with excitement and pregnant with suspense that the moment of and the moment after just simply don't have. So a lot of people think those fingers are touching. They are not. No. This is the moment before Adam is about to get life.
And I think you see that actually in Adam's pose. So in the image, he's on the left and he's reclining on some green landscape. And he's reclining in a way that probably recalls the pose of an ancient sculpture of a river god.
River god, yeah.
Who would often be reclining. But he's extremely muscle-bound. I mean, he's a fine specimen of a man, unsurprisingly, given that this is Michelangelo we're talking about, who loved depicting the male nude above all else. But he has this sort of, it's not quite passive, but it's maybe languid, maybe slightly listless. The head is just moving around. His left arm it's not limp, it's being raised, but it doesn't have the same sense of physical activity and assertion that if you look on the right of the image, God with the heavenly host all surrounded in this, is that his big red cape that seems to be covering the angels that he's approaching with. I mean, I assume they're angels.
Yeah, and there's Eve in there as well.
And Eve is underneath his left arm, looking over at her future mate in a way that could be described as... She's quite into him.
Do you think?
I don't know. Slightly nervous about what's happening. Is that sort of...
she's apprehensive,
is
isn't
that
she?
young virgin on wedding night kind of expression?
This has never happened before. at all in history. One of the interesting things about that cape, have you read the many debates about that cape that's behind God, is that it's likened to the shape of a brain?
I mean, this is the thing you get told at school. I mean, to be honest, that's the main thing I always remember about this. Is there anything in the sources that suggests that that's going on? Or is that just one of those sorts of ideas that gets... Who came up with that? Which brilliant art historian had that insight, which has just stuck so...
I don't know where it originates. It certainly isn't in the primary sources. No one mentions this.
No.
But it does certainly look a bit like a brain. But it is nevertheless the whole motif of deciding to create this idea of hands outstretching. This is brand new.
But I suppose I was just to finish the point with God, is that you have the slightly more passive figure of Adam, but God and that host within the cape, they're so dynamic.
Yeah,
they're swooping in like a spaceship from the right of the image.
The wind's blowing in his face. Yeah.
And you can see his beard becomes this sort of rippling agent of his dynamism in itself, God the Father.
That's another aspect of the great innovation of this picture, is that when we today, in certainly the Western tradition, think of God, what do we think of? We think of an old man with a white beard.
Yeah.
Well, Michelangelo wasn't the first person to this, but he was one of the first people to come up with this idea that God could look like that. And again, that's another example of genius. When you do something that is so unexpected and yet ultimately, looking back, seems so obvious.
But it's... I mean, I hadn't thought this at all until we're now looking at the image, but... Given that I brought up Raphael's portrait of Pope Julius II, another bearded man,
yes.
But Raphael's Julius looks really quite feeble.
Yeah.
The point about Michelangelo's God the Father is he does have flowing grey locks and this grey beard, but he's very strong. He's still very powerful and vigorous as a figure, very active and dynamic. And although at this point, I mean, one of the things about Michelangelo is he lives until he's almost 89. I mean, that's just so rare at this time. He has this great longevity. We've done a couple of episodes about Holbein, and Erasmus, the great scholar at that moment, was featured. I think Erasmus put old age around about this moment in the 16th century as sort of maybe late 30s. I mean, we're several feet in the grave.
Yeah.
But this God the Father, even though he must be so much older in terms of his depiction, he still has the vigour of a young man.
Yes. I'm getting a sense that you're not quite as persuaded by this image as I am.
I don't think that's totally fair. I think the thing that the trouble I have with this is that I've been to the Sistine Chapel, and it's... Maybe I'm just hugely spoilt.
Yes.
As an art critic, I normally get to go and see something when there are no crowds there whatsoever.
Yeah.
But I haven't had that experience in the Vatican. Occasionally, I've had to go in there maybe to film something with the BBC, but the BBC can never afford to kind of keep it all really quiet in the way that apparently Japanese television could, where they could hire the entire chapel and do a big shoot at some stage, some legendary shoot. When you go into the chapel, you are with so many tourists. You slightly have the issue that Michelangelo had in painting the ceiling, where you're having to kind of crick your neck, you're looking upwards. It's almost 70 feet above the floor. It's quite far away. My memory is that you often have attendants who start shushing the crowds quite quickly, and you sort of get moved on. So, and then you have the issue of almost like that blooming mould that appeared on the very earliest scene. You have the mould of familiarity, which covers an image like this. It's almost impossible to look at it and see it as a work of art at all. It's just so familiar.
I think that it's been a victim of its own success. And I think that because of that, I think it's hard. This is what I'm trying to capture in the way I describe it. It's hard to understand how truly radical it was in terms of its representation of this scene. The idea of depicting life being passed from God to Adam, the creation of our own species through these two hands reaching each other, is such a brilliant idea. It seems so obvious in retrospect, but no one had done that before. And, for me, that motif, the motif of the two figures reaching towards each other and, of course, not quite touching, is such a powerful one. And it's symbolic not just of God and Adam. It becomes symbolic for everything. It's symbolic of desire, of yearning, for our attempts as human beings to connect with other people. And that is why I think this picture does transcend its origins. It transcends its subject matter, and why it has become, for good or for bad, a kind of universal image. It's become something that has... but turned into a meme, I suppose, in popular culture as well. There's the famous example. There's so many examples of this image being cannibalized by popular culture. The most famous example for me, anyway, is the film E.T.
Yes.
The 1982 film, Steven Spielberg film, in which a little lovable alien makes a friendship with this boy called Elliot. And in the theatrical posters in 82, they had the two fingers. There was the earth in the background, the two fingers reaching each other. One was obviously an alien finger.
Glowing, was it?
There was a spark of light in between. That is, that is all down to Michelangelo. It's Michelangelo's idea. And as I say, it has become a universal idea for connection.
I think that's very persuasive. I'm not going to challenge that. I think, that makes sense.
But it's taken together, this fresco cycle is truly astonishing. And I thought I'd just quote Goethe here, because Goethe, the great German writer and philosopher, in 1787, he went into the Sistine Chapel and he wrote, "Until you have seen the Sistine Chapel, you can have no adequate conception of what man is capable of accomplishing. One hears and reads of so many great and worthy people, but here, above one's head and before one's eyes, is living evidence of what one man has done." And I agree with him. I think that this is it is a great, great human achievement.
It is undoubtedly a great human achievement. And maybe we should just leave it there. Because I don't know. I mean, the only thing is that we risk... The thing I said at the very beginning of the series is that you do get, with Michelangelo, you get this hagiography that surrounds him. And it's a sign of my triviality and insignificance in the big scheme of things, that a streak of me slightly always reacts against that a little bit. Because, it makes me want to say, well, actually, as a unified programme, it has its problems.
Yeah.
It's not the whole ceiling. It isn't the most perfect work of art in that sense, yet it has this status. But I do agree that within it, there are these scenes, and you've spoken beautifully and very eloquently about one of them in particular, that have this tremendous power, and they are seen, appropriately given their setting high above us, as the great high point of Western painting.
Michelangelo has just completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and he's hoping that he can now get the opportunity he's been waiting for, which is to get back to sculpture and specifically to get back to the tomb of Julius II, his great patron. But Julius, who is now in his late 60s, has fallen ill. Now, up until this point, Alastair, Julius was he was a sort of Donald Trump figure. He was indestructible. And there's an author called Ross King who's written a very good book about the painting of the Sistine Chapel. And Ross King says, Julius had cheated death many times, having survived dangerous bouts of illness and several assassination attempts, eluded ambushes and kidnappings, dodged cannonballs, and defied unfavourable prophecies and portents. But in February 1513, just a few months after the Sistine Chapel ceiling is completed, he runs out of road. He falls ill. And shortly after drinking some gold...
Is that right?
Yes.
Why was he doing that to prolong his life?
His doctors told him.
An elixir.
Yeah. It proved had to have the opposite effect. He dies. And Julius II dies on the 21st of February, 1513. A conclave is assembled under Michelangelo's ceiling, the first conclave under Michelangelo's ceiling. And Julius is succeeded by Giovanni de' Medici.
Now, he's a very, very interesting figure in the story because he's someone that Michelangelo he knew him rather well from Florence back in the day.
He did. He was one of Lorenzo the Magnificent's sons and would have been a childhood friend, or at least an acquaintance of Michelangelo. They would have known each other, similar age. They would have known each other in Florence, in the palace in San Marco. And he becomes Pope, and he becomes Pope Leo X.
There's the wonderful quote that may or may not have been uttered by him.
Go on.
Supposedly, when he attains the papacy, he said, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." and he's sort of associated, isn't he, with... He is a great patron of the arts.
He is, yeah.
But he's spending pretty lavishly and diminishing and exhausting the papal treasury during his pontificate. He eventually dies in 1521. And of course, this is the moment of this great schism in the church in Europe. And partly Leo's reign, if you like, his time in charge, may contribute to some of those bigger forces that are threatening to rip the church apart.
But I quite like Leo. I think he's certainly a nicer guy than Julius was. And he does, in the aftermath of Julius's death, he does Julius a massive favour. And he says to Michelangelo, OK, you can do Julius's tomb.
Yeah.
He's under no pressure to do that, really. I mean, there is some pressure from Julius's family, but he doesn't need to do it.
But the family pressure is important because, this is a powerful family, and a lot of money has been spoken about in the contracts.
Yes.
And over time, because the tomb of Julius II is a horribly long-winded, complex project that
project, really.
Tragic. I mean, it was,
it's like HS2.
The tragedy, yes, HS2.
It drags on for decades. It's constantly being scaled back.
Yes, and it sort of bedevils scholars, but scholars also really love sort of teasing out what it should have looked like, could have looked like. And I have to say, I don't want to sound like a total heathen, but I slightly start glazing over with all of those sort of details and experiments.
Me too.
Because there are so many iterations of it. But the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, there is this family where the heirs of Pope Julius II, they're on Michelangelo's back.
Yeah.
And he starts to get the reputation for basically taking the money with no intention of wanting to complete the work. And that is a big problem for him. It seems to really eat him up over time. And much later, a different pope is going to start issuing decrees to completely absolve him of all his obligations regarding the tomb. But at this point, he does sign another contract, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's for a smaller tomb. We've said how the project keeps being scaled back. It's a smaller tomb. It's no longer freestanding. There are fewer figures. But Michelangelo is nevertheless delighted because finally, after years and years of waiting, this is 8 years after he starts working on the tomb, he's finally able to get back to it. So he moves properly to Rome and moves into a house on a street called the Macelli dei Corvi, the slaughterhouse of the crows.
Oh, I think this is near Trajan's Column.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a really, the street is bad. There's a meat market there. It stinks. There's rubbish in the streets. But he quite likes it, and he lives in this house on and off really for the rest of his life.
I think he's meant to pay rent, but never does.
Oh,
and
right. So
it's
he doesn't
part of
buy
a
it
contract connected with the tomb.
Right. Okay. Yes.
And in the end, but he's just like, you know what? It's just my house. and finally, because he lives for so long and things change. I mean, that is effectively what does happen.
Right. Okay. So he spends the next 3 years, 1513 to 1516, working on the project. He's using actually marble that he has excavated himself years earlier and has been sitting in the piazza ready to be used for 7 years, 8 years by this stage. And he makes progress, starts to make a few figures. The most famous figure he makes for the tomb is this great figure of Moses.
Yes.
Moses of Ten Commandments fame. Actually, it's interesting. You know who played Moses in the Ten Commandments film?
It wasn't Heston.
It was Charlton Heston.
Was it really?
There you go.
No, yeah.
Gets everywhere. So this is a depiction of Moses holding the tablets, holding the Ten Commandments. It's a very impressive sculpture. It's really typical of Michelangelo at this heroic phase in his career when everyone looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his pomp. It's very muscular. It's beautifully done. It's technically excellent.
And originally was meant to be above ground level.
Yeah.
Because it obviously exists. You can see it today in a different form of the tomb than that which Michelangelo originally had conceived. And the original conception, there would have been, 40-odd figures. There's this cornice 13 feet above. And when it was going to be a completely freestanding monument, Moses would have been one of the corner figures that you're looking up at. So there's maybe some distortions, right, to the anatomy, which are meant to compensate for how you were meant to look at it. How you see it now is much closer to, it's ground level.
Yeah.
But it still has, as you say, this sense of monumental power, but also sort of psychological power.
Yes, there's an intensity to it, isn't there?
As if maybe it's expressing that great quality we've touched on, the terribilità, which Michelangelo was meant to have, and to a degree the Pope had, Julius himself. It's sort of this, Moses is almost this fused self-portrait of the Pope, that somehow those energies are being distilled in the sculpture. I have a question for you, because I find it very interesting to think about the tomb and the sculptures that we know, and specifically the Moses, in relation to the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Because lots of people have said that Michelangelo has his plans for the tomb, then he's asked to do the ceiling, and the tomb is completely frustrated and is the great tragedy of his life. And consequently, he almost, quote unquote, sort of realizes his vision for the tomb in the painting of the ceiling. But I wonder whether it's the other way around, in a sense, because he has the idea for the tomb, but actually really early on, even before 1508, there are glimmerings that the idea of painting the ceiling is already being discussed and that Michelangelo may be involved. He paints the ceiling, and we know that there's this amazing transformation in his art that becomes more expressive and powerful and monumental, more sculptural. And then he returns to the tomb and creates images like this. And I mean, do you think there's anything to that?
I think there's a definite crossover there. One of the things that people don't necessarily realise when they look up at the ceiling is that the architecture of the ceiling is painted. It is, it's a curved ceiling, but it's just essentially plaster. All of the architectural stuff, those spandrels and groins and niches and things like that you're talking about.
Kind of you say not droning on about, but yeah.
Yeah, those are all painted. So it's almost as though Michelangelo is trying to fulfill a sculptural commission in the painting. He's painting a lot of stonework. And the figures, as you say, become very, very sculptural as they go on. By the time you get to the end, when you look at the great Sibyls and the figure of Jonah, they are taking these very Moses-like forms. They look like they're carved out of marble. So I think there's a lot of overlap visually, creatively between the two. The thing that is really interesting about Moses, or curious, I should say, about Moses, is he has horns.
Yes, he does.
Have you noticed the horns?
I have noticed the horns. I thought you were going to go with the beard.
The beard is great.
I mean, very briefly on the beard, because I love...
There's a lot of beard action in this episode.
There's a lot of beards popping up in this episode, it's true. But there's a very long flowing beard that Moses has. And I mean, it's mentioned by some of the early biographers of Michelangelo, but you can see his hands playing with the hair. So there's this sense of... It's marble, it's massive, there's monumental power, but there's something which is quite delicate about that, which gives it a slightly different complexion, I think. A lot of energy. But yes, if you follow the eye up from the fingers playing in the beard, up past Moses' face with that expression of terribilità, you have these two cornettos which are plonked in his hair. And... my understanding of this,
he didn't actually have horns.
He didn't have horns, but that it's this all has the whole thing of Moses. It's a mistranslation.
Yeah, so it's a mistranslation. So effectively, what happens is when Moses descends from Mount Sinai after getting the Ten Commandments in the Book of Exodus, which is written in Hebrew, of course, the text tells us that his face was radiant, and the term they use was karan or. But when this passage, in fact, the whole Old Testament, was first translated into Latin from the Hebrew by St. Jerome in a translation that we still know as the Vulgate. Jerome had made a mistake and had thought that instead of it was karan or, he thought it said cornuta, which meant horns. So from that point onwards, throughout the Middle Ages, artists presumed that Moses had horns, or at least maybe they didn't necessarily think he did have horns, but the horns became a kind of attribute. They became a signifier of Moses. If you had a complex set of paintings with lots of different figures in it, if you saw horns, you would know, well, that's Moses.
So, question. I think it's correct to say that by the time Michelangelo is sculpting Moses, it's known that the horns is a mistranslation thing. We've established that Michelangelo is this great innovator. You see that in the Sistine ceiling. Why is he sticking with convention here and keeping the horns, which kind of are a little distracting? What do you think?
I just don't know. No. I cannot understand it. Perhaps one explanation is that in Michelangelo's vision of the tomb, there would be many figures, dozens of different figures. It would have been quite a complicated iconography to follow.
Right.
Possibly the horns were considered to be useful in terms of understanding and decoding the scheme. But ultimately, I don't really know, because he was always taking liberties. He was always pushing towards a form of naturalism. We saw that with David as well. So this harking back to a much older, more archaic way of representation doesn't quite clock for me. I don't quite understand it.
I think your explanation there, I'd buy that.
It does make the sculpture more powerful, though, in some ways. It's much more
Certainly
memorable. It's much more memorable. Anyway, he works on the tomb for a few years. But then, once again, this is the world that Michelangelo lives in. 1516, things change again, because in 1516, Pope Leo X falls out with Julius's family. They're actually, I think, battling over the town of Urbino. So I think Julius's family run the town of Urbino. Pope Leo wanted the Medici to run Urbino. There is actually a brief war, and Urbino is taken back by Leo. And so by this stage, Julius's family are Leo's enemies, and he's like, well, why should I have the greatest artist in Italy working on their project? I want him to work on my project. And so he takes poor Michelangelo off the tomb yet again. And Leo X asks Michelangelo to work on something for his family up in Florence. And that is namely reconstructing the facade, the front, of the family church in Florence, the Church of San Lorenzo. This project is another catastrophe.
So this is a project which never is realised.
Never realised.
Wasn't there some
If you go to Florence today, there is still no facade.
No.
500 years later on the front of the building, it looks like a building site. The real problem at the heart of this project is that Leo obviously wants a great marble facade for the church, but he doesn't want the marble to come from Carrara, which is where marble had nearly always come from since Roman times, where Michelangelo had historically got his marble. He wants the marble to come from a nearby quarry, nearby mountain called Pietrasanta.
Oh, yes.
And the reason he wants this is this quarry is run by the Medici. So it's a classic Italian backhander. But unlike Carrara, which had been operated as a quarry since Roman times and had a pretty decent infrastructure, there was a workforce, there were roads, there was a connection to the river and the barges, Pietrasanta had nothing. But that's what he insisted on. So Michelangelo actually spends 2 or 3 years up in the Apuan Alps, up in Pietrasanta, actually creating a quarry from scratch.
Yeah, but this is what he loves, isn't it?
Well, he actually has a terrible time. He has a terrible time because he's obviously he's having to build roads. Michelangelo actually building roads.
Okay.
He's trying to get hold of a workforce. No one wants to work with him because the people in Carrara are so annoyed about this rival quarry being opened that they're not willing to cooperate. They actually bribe the bargemen to not take any of the marble. And Michelangelo's plan is for these enormous blocks of marble. There are columns that are 26 feet long, and he's trying to get them out of the quarry and down the mountainside. People are killed on as the marble slips down the mountain. Bits of column burst into 1,000 pieces. It's an absolute disaster. Michelangelo is injured in the process as well. It is a terrible, terrible experience for him. So it was a complete waste of time. And as I say, if you go to Florence today, you will see no marble on the front of San Lorenzo. It's still the exposed brickwork. And all the while, of course, Alastair, the tomb lies unfinished. But there are some other works from the tomb that themselves aren't finished. But they are really remarkable pieces of work themselves, aren't they?
I find the whole unfinished question very interesting because there are roughly 40, 45, maybe 43, something like that, extant marble sculptures by Michelangelo. And a large number of them, 26, something like that, are unfinished. And I think for modern viewers especially, that is something which is fascinating and a big part of his appeal as an artist. And there's a whole series of figures that were once going to be part of the Julius tomb, which have different, retrospective names. There's the so-called dying slave, there's the rebellious captive. And in all of them, you see a figure which seems to be only half emerged out of the marble block. And there's something quite romantic about this idea that here is genius at work. And it's almost as if had those figures been completed, they would lack some of that X factor which Michelangelo is bringing.
Yeah.
Now, is there one in particular you're wanting to focus on?
I love them all. Actually, if you go to the Accademia Gallery in Florence, which famously Alastair hasn't been to,
don't bring it up again.
Everyone goes there to see the David, the original David, not the copy that is in the square. And everyone's standing, crowding around the David, getting their selfies. But in the next room, right next to the David, you have a group of these unfinished figures that Michelangelo intended for the tomb, but because the tomb was constantly being scaled back, they were never needed.
Yes.
So he never completed them. And for me, these works are just so much more thrilling, so much more exciting, so much more moving even than David. As you know, I'm a big fan of David for the very reason that they are unfinished, in that they give us this insight into the working process, don't they? And
But I think they do, totally. And you can see the kind of chisel marks in many of his unfinished sculptures, and that's in itself quite fascinating to see this kind of maelstrom of how quickly he's working and with a variety of tools, all of that. But there's something else where I think it starts to work on a deeper level of metaphor, where you have the finished image versus the block. And it's about, what is it? It's sort of, order and chaos.
Yeah.
It's the kind of creation that we saw on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It's about a sense maybe even of a Christian world versus a pagan world. You can see all of these oppositions in those different finishes. And I think as well, there's something quite interesting. This is the beginning of... We've already touched on this a few times, but this kind of the way that Michelangelo is raising the status of the artist. And there's somehow this sense with the unfinished works that it's the authenticity, something that's by his own hand. That's what's being really prized by the culture more widely. And so it becomes this great marker of genius. And there's that wonderful passage, I think it must be in Vasari, where he's sort of describing the way... this idea that the artist has a vision in his or her mind, and this vision is somehow trapped within, like the soul is within the human body, but you can find it by just chipping away the marble and revealing it. And I think Vasari uses this image of, it's as if you've got a model which is submerged, and then very slowly you lift up the model and it goes above the surface of the water and you start to see it crystallize and coalesce before your eyes. And you have that feeling when you're looking at those unfinished sculptures.
Yeah, they have become, right or for wrong, a metaphor for Michelangelo's process, the act of creation, but also a metaphor for the human struggle, for freedom or for whatever it is.
Well, partly because some of those slaves themselves have fetters. They're sort of shackled, so they're struggling against bonds. You can see around, say, a chest. And that's what you're describing of the figure emerging from the stone. It's enacting that same struggle.
And they will become very prophetic, Alastair, because in the 1520s, Michelangelo will himself briefly become a prisoner. So please do join us next time when we will focus on the last and perhaps most dramatic chapter in Michelangelo's life story. You're not going to want to miss it. But for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please do follow Stories of Art wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe even leave a review.